Good day and welcome to our online message for this week. My name is Deanne Carter and I serve as the pastor of Margarettsville and Lower Granville Baptist churches. Since Easter, we've been looking at some of the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus as recorded in the scriptures. And today we find ourselves in John chapter 21, the first 14 verses. This is actually the third time that we know of that Jesus has appeared to the group of disciples. In each of the first two appearances, they were together in the upper room with the door locked for fear of the Jews. The first time Thomas was not there, but the second time he was. Now in today's passage, we see 7 of the disciples. We see Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathaniel, James, and John, and 2 others that are not named. And they've traveled to Galilee as Jesus has told them to do. Back in Matthew, Jesus had sent word to his disciples to go ahead to Galilee and he would meet them there. So in obedience, they are now in Galilee. Now, we have no idea of the time frame when he appeared in the upper room to Thomas and when he appears on the beach in our passage today. We're also left to wonder, where are the other disciples? Because they're not all together at this point. But from what we do know about the disciples, we know Peter, he could be quite impulsive. He was not one to stand around. He and the others may have been waiting for Jesus for some time. We don't know. Only that it was somewhere between day 8 and day 40. So as this passage opens, we see Peter saying, I'm going fishing, going out to fish. And some of the commentators, they feel that this meant Peter was stepping away from his faith. He was going back to his old way of life, fishing for fish. Others say, well, he needed to provide for himself and to make a living, and that's why he went fishing. But whatever the reason, we're led to believe that Peter was struggling. He and the others had been through so much with Jesus. They had left their previous way of life to follow him. They had been by Jesus' side through 3 years of ministry. Their lives had changed drastically since Jesus called them to come and follow him. And now, with the crucifixion and the resurrection and his appearance to them after rising from the dead, imagine they were all still trying to understand it all. And of course, we can't forget how it had been left between Peter and Jesus when Peter denied Jesus 3 times that Jesus had predicted before his arrest. I imagine Peter's head was spinning. It seems that he and the others were trying to be obedient. They had come to Galilee as Jesus was supposed to meet them there. But where was he? Peter hadn't talked to him yet, and he didn't know when he would see him again. So maybe to escape his own thoughts, he decides to go fishing, back to what he knows. And the other disciples follow Peter's lead. Some of them were fishermen as well, after all. All except for Thomas. But Thomas wasn't going to miss out on anything like he had in the upper room that first time. So he stays with this core group of disciples. Tells us they fished all night and they caught nothing. Absolutely nothing. What were they doing wrong? Where were all the fish? It was common for the fishermen in that day to fish at night. I read that the cooling waters actually drew fish up to the surface. And the fishermen would also use torches or lamps to attract the fish to the surface so that the nets could be drawn up to catch them. They would use a large weighted net thrown from a boat and then dragged towards the shore. Sometimes two boats stretched the net between themselves. But this time, this night, the net remained empty. They had worked hard all night for nothing, and now it's coming daylight. Imagine that scene in your mind. They're tired, they're frustrated. When this stranger, aka Jesus, calls out from shore, "Did you catch any fish?" Now, of course, he knew they hadn't, but he asked them this question so that they acknowledge their failure. And he tells them to let down the net on the other side of the boat. Now, this probably sounded silly to these experienced fishermen, but for some reason, they do as he suggests. And everything changes. Their nets get so full of fish that they can't even pull it up onto the boat. How is it that this stranger knew there would be fish on the other side of the boat? How could he see what they couldn't? Well, it was then that John, with his quick perception, recognized the stranger to be Jesus. And he said, "It is the Lord." John, he seemed to realize that this kind of dramatic change from failure to success, from no fish to a lot of fish, could only be attributable to one person. And that was Jesus. After all, they had experienced something like this before, hadn't they? With an abundant catch of fish and Jesus. Upon hearing John's exclamation of, "This is Jesus," Peter is out of the boat and he grabs his cloak and he jumps into the water and he makes his way to Jesus. Your typical Peter response. The others make their way to shore too, dragging the fish behind the boat. And when they get there, they find the presence of their dear friend Jesus, and he has breakfast waiting for them. He invites them to come and eat. And in that culture, an invitation to come and to eat was an invitation to friendship. Their dear friend was there on shore, waiting for them. Jesus knew all that had happened. They had run away from him. They had let him down time and time again. But here he is asking them, inviting them to come and eat with him once again. So, what do you think would be the lesson for the disciples in this experience? What is the lesson for us today, for all the readers of this beautiful passage of Scripture? Well, there seems to be many, many lessons in this short passage. So let's look at just a few today. First, I think this passage shows us how we can receive God's blessing in our lives. As we strive to follow God, we really need to listen to what God tells us and do as he says. We need to be obedient. As the hymn says, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. And we can be obedient because we know that God's way is always the best way. The disciples saw that in this lesson, and they never forgot it again. You know, when they dropped that net on the other side of the boat, as Jesus told them to do, it resulted in a full overflowing net. 153 fish as compared to an empty net when they tried all night to do it on their own. Maybe you've tried to accomplish something on your own. And then as you realized it was just not working, you called out to God and you followed his leading. And things changed. It worked. You see, when we're obedient, God will truly bless us. It may not happen immediately like it did for the disciples with the fish, but it will happen either in this lifetime or in eternity. Smith's Bible commentary draws our attention to a little fact in this story that we might easily miss. They point out that what the disciples could not all do in their own efforts out in the boat when they tried to pull in the net of fish into the boat, Peter was able to do by himself when Jesus told him to do it. Jesus said, "Now go draw the net." And Peter, because Jesus had commanded it, was able to do it by himself, though all of them weren't able to do it when they were together in the boat. It's interesting, isn't it? The strength of the commands of Jesus. The very fact that God tells us to do it, if we will just endeavor, we will be able to, because he gives us the ability to obey his commands. So the importance of obedience is lesson 1. Another lesson, sorry about that, a dog had a fit here. Jasper, stop. Another lesson that we can glean from this passage is the fact that Jesus was still with them, meeting their needs. John MacArthur says, one thing they experience from this event is that the fish they just caught and the meal that Jesus provided demonstrated to the disciples that Jesus could and would still meet their needs, even though things had changed. Whatever doubts they had, whatever ideas they might have had about going back to their way of life before, that was all done at this point. What Jesus did here on the beach that morning settled forever in their minds that they were called to serve Jesus Christ for the rest of their lives. They were called to be fishers of men, not fishers of fish. Not that long before this, they had all left Jesus and they had fled in different directions. Their world was turned upside down and they were afraid for their lives if they were found to have been associated with Jesus. They deserted him. And now, after how they had acted and all that Jesus endured leading up to his death on the cross, here he is in his resurrection body, still loving his disciples. He wasn't angry at them. He wasn't angry at their actions. He didn't act the way that they had, but he continues to help them, to serve them, to take care of them and their needs. He continues to love them and be there for them. The same is true for us. Jesus will meet our needs too. He has not forsaken you, no matter how you have acted. He still loves you, and he's there for you. Third, Jesus uses weak, sinful people to advance his kingdom. Isn't that wonderful news? I can't imagine what the disciples were thinking as they gathered there on the beach and they ate the food that Jesus had prepared for them. How unworthy they must have felt, but how loved and filled with joy. As they gathered there that morning, they would have had time to reflect. Maybe they remembered the experience they had back in Luke 5. You know, they had to have remembered that because it was so similar to what they had just gone through. The disciples had been fishing all night. They had caught nothing, and Jesus said, "Put your nets down in this water over here and see what happens." And they filled up 2 boats full of fish that had started to sink. That's when Jesus told them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Jesus didn't need them, but he chose them to help him with the advancement of his kingdom. They had failed him, But here he was, still with them, calling them again. You know, Jesus doesn't need us either, but he chooses to work through us, as imperfect as we are. His Spirit works inside of us and makes us more like him. And his Spirit also works through us to reach others. And as we serve the Lord with our lives, it's his power, not yours, not mine, but his, that makes the work successful. So we have obedience, we have Jesus' presence and care, and his use of sinful people for the advancement of the kingdom. There are other lessons in this passage as well, but I'm going to leave it at that today. And I encourage you to read this passage, to meditate upon it, to pray it, and ask the Holy Spirit to reveal the lesson he may want you to learn from these words. God bless each and every one of you. Thank you for joining with me today. Have a great week. I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye for now.